now the defenders of the stronghold of democracy and of equal opportunity.
You and I, as citizens, have the obligation to shape the debates of our time, not only with the votes we cast, but with the voices we lift.
The people are looking for honest answers, not easy answers.
The very word secrecy is repugnant.
Clear leadership.
And we are, as a people,
not false claims and evasiveness and politics as usual.
Opposed to secret societies.
As a people, we cannot afford to let any group of citizens or any individual citizen live or labor under conditions which are injurious to the Commonwealth.
Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, young, old, gay, straight, men, women, folks with disabilities, all pledging allegiance under the same proud flag to this big, bold country that we love. That's what I see. That's the America I know.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Welcome to the Aggressive Progressive Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Hahn. I'm at Christopher Hahn on X, Christopher Hahn NY on Instagram, and ChristopherHahn.com. Thank you for subscribing to my podcast. Please share it with your friends. We got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about core values of competency and accountability. Let's talk. Reckless, criminal, incompetent. These are words that Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and Donald Trump used to describe Hillary Clinton's private email server back in 2016. It was the issue, the pinnacle issue, in my opinion, that gave Donald Trump the presidency. There is no issue as grand as that. It was the pinnacle issue. So when Tim Walz, Marco Rubio, Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, and Pete Hegseth add a reporter from The Atlantic to a text chain that they were using on the app Signal, which you could download right now yourself at the App Store. And by the way, Tim Walz, I believe, was in Moscow while this was happening. Somebody was in Moscow when this was happening. It was also on the text chain. I might be wrong about Tim Walz. In fact, I think I am. Unencrypted, unprotected, and without a doubt being hacked by the Russians while he's there, whoever was there. It's the guy who's the Middle East envoy, and I'm drawing a Howard Lutnick, drawing a blank on his name. I mean, they were sharing war plans on this app, which is bad enough. They were sharing war plans on this app while looping in a reporter from a magazine who does not have the security clearances needed to get this information, while also one of them in the chat group was in Moscow. Let me refresh your memory. Criminal, reckless, incompetent. And let me add another word that they also used, dangerous, and a threat to our national security. And Donald Trump's like, no big deal. Nobody's going to get fired over it because we're hypocrites. We don't. The only standards we have are double. I mean, it is kind of ridiculous, but par for the course, right? This is not the first time, nor the last time they will recklessly disregard security protocols for convenience, because that's what these people do. Pete Hegseth is not a DEI hire. Pete Hegseth is a DUI hire. Let me say that again. Pete Hegseth is definitely not a DEI hire because he would have been better. He is a DUI hire, and he should resign immediately in the interest of national security. And there was a hearing, and there'll be more hearings. And it is claimed that Pete Hegseth is the one who added the reporter to the group chat. Then Pete Hegseth went on TV to try to discredit the reporter and say, oh, what are you going to believe, the Atlantic over me? Fox News weekend anchor, drunk? I am, look, I'm not surprised that they're going to just ignore this at the moment. And Donald Trump saying nobody should apologize. Nobody should apologize. There's nothing to apologize for. Yeah, apologize to the American people. Apologize to the men and women who are risking their lives for this country to stop the Houthis, which is a good thing to do. But when you're leaking the war plans to the Russians and to the media, you are putting their lives in jeopardy. You are risking the lives of men and women in uniform. So spare me your BS, Pete Hegseth, about how much you care about the men and women in uniform. And yes, we thank you for your service, but you have forgotten that a long time ago. Because if you are going to recklessly risk their lives by sharing war plans on a Signal app, well, one of the people on your chat chain is in Russia, in Moscow, right at the moment you were doing it. You don't belong in that office, and you clearly don't have respect for the men and women who serve this country and put their lives on the line for it. You do not. And it is time for you to go right now. And, Trump's like, nobody's going to get fired. Tragedy. Pete Hegseth gave up a great job at Fox. Yeah, he did, and he shouldn't have. He should have said, no, I'm not experienced enough for this job, because that's what somebody who loves the men and women who serve this country would have done. No respect for anybody but himself. That's the MO of this administration. I am your host, Chris Hahn. I'm at Christopher Hahn on X, Christopher Hahn NY on Instagram, and ChristopherHahn.com. If you're not already watching me on YouTube, I am at The Aggressive Progressive on YouTube. Check me out there. I'm putting stuff up 5, sometimes 6 days a week. Check it out. And of course, the Aggressive Progressive podcast is available wherever you get your podcast. I'm at the Aggressive Progressive on YouTube. And while you're there, subscribe. And if you like what you're hearing, tell your friends. All right. So yesterday I started talking about core values. I've been thinking about this a lot, and how Democrats can repackage themselves. I mean, the events of today, the past couple of days of this, ridiculous, I mean, this isn't even a scandal, right? This is just stupidity on full display. It's hard to call it a scandal when it's all out in the open, and it's stupidity on display. I think one of the core values Democrats need to exhibit is competence and accountability, right? Because you're not always going to have competent, you're going to think people are competent, and maybe they appear competent on paper. I mean, anybody who's worked in a business or had to hire people, sometimes people come in and you think they're great, right? They look great on paper, and maybe I'm going to hire this person. But when they mess up, you either got to correct it or you got to let them go. And I think that Democrats need to have as one of their core principles that they show the voters is competence and accountability in government. And they go hand in hand. So I'm not saying that, everybody here is going to be competent all the time. But when they do things that are incompetent, they will be held accountable for it to the proper level, right? I mean, this is what we've got to try to work out as Democrats, right? How do we communicate that we are better than them? Well, here is a classic example, and I think it has to be the core principle of the Democratic Party. When people do things like this, there needs to be a complete review and accountability, and not a 6-7 month process. A week. This doesn't take much. What went wrong here? What needs to be followed in the future? And who needs to be held accountable for it? And then you hold those people accountable in a very public way. You're going to be in the highest levels of office in this country. You're going to be held accountable in a very public way if you mess up. So let me start my core values list for Democrats. Core value number 1 is competency and accountability in government. And we are going to pledge to hire the best people, and we are going to hold them accountable for their positions and the results and the mistakes they make. Doesn't mean you fire people every time something goes wrong, but you do hold them accountable and you find a way to correct the problems in the future. This situation with these, with them leaking war plans to a reporter and literally Hegseth put it on the app. He brought him in. Was Hegseth promised not to be drinking when he took this job. Is he keeping that promise? Anybody checking up on that? Because I got to tell you, that's a pretty dumb thing to do. How do you do that? How does he, especially like what he said about this reporter? Why is that reporter in his contacts? You got to ask yourself that question. So it is a little crazy. And I think he needs to be held accountable. I think he needs to be fired for it. President of the United States. If I was president of the United States right now, I would hold them accountable. I would fire one of them for sure. I would create a new policy about how they are going to communicate, especially when they're in Russia. The special envoy should not have been sitting in his hotel room on a Signal app talking about war plans while he's in Moscow. If he wanted to have any conversation at all with the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and the DNI, he needed to go to the skiff in the embassy and have that conversation there. So I don't know if there's a policy here, and there probably is. The policy clearly wasn't being followed. So you need to hold the person who did not follow that accountable. And this person, the special envoy, he needs to go too. I mean, if that's what was happening, and I believe it was, that he was sitting in his hotel room or maybe even in the Kremlin itself having this conversation, do you not think that the Russians are capable, while you're sitting there, of intercepting your communications? Are you out of your freaking mind? Again, accountability and competence in government needs to be a priority, needs to be a core value for Democrats going forward, that we will only hire competent people and we will hold them accountable for the results they are supposed to get and for the mistakes they make. Very simple, right? They got to boil down these messages to simple messages. Competence and accountability. I mean, Donald Trump is not holding anybody accountable, and these people are surely not competent that are working for him. They are. I mean, you watch this hearing today. If you watched any of it, I mean, yesterday, because I know this comes on tomorrow. Sorry, I pre-tape. You watch this hearing. The incompetence. The Tulsi Gabbard was clearly out of her depth. Pete Hegseth didn't testify because he was somewhere else. When he comes back, we will see how much he's out of his depth. And he'll just start yelling and, being tough and a strong man at the hearing. That's going to be his response to this. Watch. Mark my words. He will be angry and throw down. And the thing is, buddy, what were you doing the night you added the reporter to your Signal chat while you were handing over the war plans about how we're going to attack the Houthis? What were you doing? Where were you? Who were you with? What was in your glass that night? Because you promised the American people you would stop drinking. This sounds like a mistake you might have made because your hand slipped. Why would your hand be slipping? I'm not saying he was doing it, but I think it's a fair question for senators to ask him on both sides of the aisle. And this should not be a partisan thing. He put American military personnel at risk. Period. Full stop. It is ridiculous. Incompetent and ridiculous. And, Donald Trump saying nobody getting fired, he should be asking for resignations right now. It is beyond me. This is again, the only standards they have are double standards. All right, I'm going to remind you now, as I always do, to seek the truth, question everyone and everything, even me. Seek the truth. I know it's out there, and I know you'll find it if you look for it. And I'll be back here again real soon to tell you the truth as I see it. I'm Chris Hahn. Thanks for joining me on the Aggressive Progressive Podcast.